deck of cards. You get to pick one card from the deck. If you pick any card other than the ace of spades, you win a great prize. Pick the ace of spades, you lose your life. Those are the odds that we deal with on each and every space shuttle flight. But we know that. We know that this is a high-risk proposition. So we try to focus on that risk in everything we do. Almost everything. We try to drive down the risk to the lowest extent possible in 1,000 different ways. A big exercise in risk management. And as the commander of the space shuttle, as a guy who's like in charge of this operation in space, one of the things that I do to try to reduce risk is to pay attention to the small details. Paying attention to these very small details is incredibly important whenever you're trying to do something that's really complicated. The other thing we try to do is try to put really good teams of people together. People that can work well together, whether it's in the Mission Control Center, the people processing the space shuttle for launch, or the crew members. And as the commander of a space shuttle flight, I get some say as to who my other crew members are going to be. And there are qualities that I look for in these people, like Eagle Scout kind of qualities. Competence is at the top of the list. But there's also the things that I don't want. And my biggest pet peeve, the thing that I do not want in another crew member, is the yes people. You know what that is? Yes men, yes women. People that are going to tell me what they think that I want to hear. I mean, I am perfectly capable of agreeing with myself. I don't need anybody telling me that. In fact, so much so that in the first meeting I have with my new crew members, which is about 2 years before we launch into space, in the very first meeting I tell them that they are required to question my decisions. It's not optional. I also tell them, don't do it out loud where I can hear you. But if you think we should be doing something differently and it affects either safety or mission success, you have to tell me about it, and we're going to figure this out together. So about 4 months after my wife was nearly killed, my crew members and I went out to the launch pad at the Kennedy Space Center to fly the final flight of Space Shuttle Endeavour. The day you're going to lift off into space, when you get out to the launch pad, which is about three hours before you lift off, the army of people, the 100 people that are normally working on the thing, or 200 people, they're gone because the space shuttle is now fully fueled, and it is pretty much a bomb sitting on a hill, and nobody wants to be around it anymore. So they left, and then we drive up there and we climb in, we get strapped into our seats, hatch gets closed, we're laying on our backs, we got to start turning on all the systems of the space shuttle. APUs, hydraulic system, electrical system needs to be correctly connected, environmental system, switches, computer needs to be in the right mode. We've got a big checklist we're working through. There's 2,000 switches and circuit breakers in the cockpit of the space shuttle. All need to be in the right place. There's a countdown clock heading towards 0. That clock stops a couple times. It'll stop to let you catch up if you've gotten behind. That's when you normally think to yourself, boy, this is a really dumb thing to be doing. But you can't get out. The hatch is closed. It would also be kind of embarrassing. At that point to say, hey, I've changed my mind. Eventually, the clock gets to 6 seconds. The 3 main engines start, come up to full power, but you don't go anywhere because you're bolted down to the launch pad with 8 giant bolts about that big. You're just bolted down, nothing holding you at the top. And the clock goes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. When it hits 0, those bolts explode simultaneously. Those big white solid rocket boosters, they ignite, and it is literally like the hand of God came down and grabbed you and ripped you off the planet. Hand of God ripped you off the planet, Padre, just like this. You know, on TV, it looks like you're really going up really smoothly. Doesn't feel anything like that. What it feels like is, imagine if you're going down the railroad tracks on a runaway train at 1,000 miles an hour, and you just keep accelerating. Incredible amount of vibration. We accelerate from 0 to 17,500 miles an hour in just 8.5 minutes. Now, 2 minutes into the flight, those big white solid rocket boosters, they come off, they parachute down into the ocean. NASA sends a ship out there, picks them up. takes them in, sends them back to the factory in Idaho, refurbishes them, we reuse them. I think they're only slightly more expensive to reuse. That's true. A little while later, we're going 25 times the speed of sound. Main engine shut down, big orange fuel tank. That thing pops off, flies halfway around the planet, hits the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean, and explodes. Pieces go into the ocean. And now we're in orbit around this incredible planet. And it is such an amazing thing to see this big round, let me say that again, round ball, a big round ball, just floating there in the blackness of space. No strings attached. And the first time I ever saw this, I was just like amazed, that all 7.5 billion of us, we live on an island in our solar system. And make no mistake, we've got no place else to go. Don't let anybody trick you to think we're all moving to Mars someday. It ain't happening. About a day and a half into the flight, we docked to this International Space Station. My crew members did a bunch of spacewalks, fixed a lot of stuff on the outside. We installed a $2 billion cosmic particle detector looking for dark matter, dark energy, antimatter in the universe. We were there for a couple weeks. And then we undock, and about a day and a half later, on the day you want to come home, on the orbit you want to come home on, you do what's called the deorbit burn. Now, the space shuttle it's by far the best spaceship ever built. Nothing comes close. It's also a pretty decent rocket ship. It's a pretty decent rocket ship. But I've got to tell you, this thing is the worst airplane I've ever flown in my life. Like, by far. And it's a really fragile machine. In fact, a former colleague of mine, a guy named Story Musgrave, used to say for liftoff, the space shuttle was like a butterfly bolted to a bullet. But now we got to fly this thing back through the atmosphere, and we're going 25 times the speed of sound. And the way we do that is over the middle of the Indian Ocean, right over the middle of the Indian Ocean, on the orbit we want to land on, we turn the space shuttle around and we slow down from 17,500 to 17,300. And because of physics, we descend. That little bit of deceleration, we descend, and when we descend, we hit the atmosphere. And by the time we hit the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean, because of all the friction and the heat that creates, we are in a giant fireball as big as Meadowlands Stadium. We are in a big ball of fire. We go screaming across the Pacific Ocean in this big ball of fire. And it is 5,000 degrees, 1 foot outside the window. And at this point, we can't decide, hey, we're going to land in Hawaii or California or Texas. We've got to go all the way to Florida and land on that single runway at the Kennedy Space Center. Has anybody seen this runway we land on? Seen this runway? Long concrete runway. You may have noticed it has water on both sides of the runway. You know what's in water in Florida? Alligators. I think NASA put that there as added motivation to land the $2 billion spaceship right on the runway. So eventually, by the time we get over Mexico, we've cooled down, we're a lot lower. Eventually, we roll into this 20-degree dive. We've got one chance to land this thing from over the middle of the Indian Ocean. It doesn't have any engines anymore. And it glides about as well as a Coke machine or a rock. So we do this approach 10 times steeper than an airliner, no engines, 300 knots. Eventually, we touch down 200 knots, we put a parachute out, roll most of the way down the runway, come to a stop. A couple hours later, we get everything turned off, and we climb out. It's the last flight of Endeavour. Now, my wife, Gabby couldn't be there on the day we landed. She was there on the day we lifted off into space. She got out of the hospital for that. But she couldn't be there on the day we landed because she was recovering from her, what we hope is her final brain surgery. And she had this surgery while I was in space. And this was replaced a piece of skull that they removed on the day she was shot with a prosthetic about the size of my hand. Now, if any of you guys would come to Tucson, Arizona, if you haven't been there before, and especially if you're one of the Boy Scouts here, if you've never been there before, Gabby will take you over to the freezer, and she'll pull out the blue Tupperware where she keeps her real skull. Now this really freaks people out. But I think it demonstrates the power of the human spirit, how people can fight to survive and then fight to come back and at least not take themselves too seriously. Now, I saw my wife's spirit really on display about 6 months after she was injured when she made a bold decision to go back to Congress to vote on a bill that would raise the debt ceiling. Now, this is a controversial vote. I think other members of Congress would love to be able to say, hey, I'm in the hospital, I'm not coming. But not my wife, Gabby. She'd been watching this on TV and seeing this in the newspaper. The morning of the vote, she hadn't made up her mind, so I called her up at this hospital and I said, Gabby, what do you want to do? You want to be there for this vote tonight? She said she did. Her Capitol Police security detail and the nurse that's with her, they head to the airport. Now, I'm about an hour south at our house in Houston, Texas. Now, if any of you guys in here, have you ever packed for your wife for a trip? This is perhaps the most dangerous thing I've ever done. Throw this stuff in the suitcase. I head to the airport. I get about halfway there, and the nurse calls me up and says, you have all of her medication, right? I turn around, go back to the house. I grab this big bag of medicine. I race to the airport. I barely make it there in time, but I do. We fly to Washington, D.C. We go to this hotel. And Gabby's young female staff members open up the suitcase and realize they need to go to the mall. So they go buy her some clothes. She barely makes it to the floor of the House of Representatives in time to have her voice heard just once more. And I couldn't be more proud of my wife, Gabby, after everything she'd been through, to be there on that day to just do her job. A newspaper, in fact, are we in Bergen County? The Bergen County Record described this day the best. It's actually the only quote I remember from this day from the Bergen County Record. They said, after months of rancor and pettiness, one small woman brought Washington to its feet. They went on and said, we can compromise on how we fund America. We cannot compromise on how we define America. That definition does not require words. Just look to Gabby Giffords. So Gabby and I attended the sentencing hearing for the guy who shot her, killed 6 of her constituents, and it was a surreal experience to be in that courtroom with him that day. I'd never seen this guy in person before. Gabby doesn't remember him from the day she was shot largely because she was shot first. She was shot in the head. In fact, the only thing she remembers from that day is a year later when we took her back to the Safeway grocery store parking lot. She remembered one thing. She remembered where she parked. That is it. Now I go into Walmart and I come out, I can't find my car. But Gabby remembered where she parked. And we had this opportunity to read a statement to the court, but Gabby had this statement she wanted read to this guy. So I turned the podium around and I read her statement. She looked him straight in the eyes and we told him a bunch of different things. But one of the first things that Gabby told him is that she would certainly trade her own life to bring back any of those 6 individuals that died that day, especially 9-year-old Christina Taylor Greene, who was born on 9/11 and had very high-minded ideas about service and democracy and deserved an entire life committed to advancing them. She didn't live to see her 10th birthday. And she was only there to ask my wife, Gabby, a question about the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and she was standing right next to my wife, and they never even had the opportunity to meet. We also told them that Gabby's life has been changed forever. The things she used to find so easy to do are now really, really hard, mostly impossible. But despite putting a bullet in her head, he hasn't put a dent in her spirit, in her desire to make the world a better place. You know, Gabby would have loved to have been here tonight. She likes New Jersey, I think because I'm from New Jersey. But she also loves Scouts. She was a Girl Scout herself, and so she wanted me to send all of you folks a message, especially the young people, the Scouts in here tonight. I explained that Gabby has aphasia, which is this difficulty with language from her brain injury. So we were working on this the other day at the breakfast table, what she wanted to say to you folks. And I was complaining about some pain I had in my right elbow. I had some surgery on my right elbow because I ripped the bicep tendon off the bone pole vaulting. Let me give you some advice. If you're over 50 years old, don't pole vault. And I was complaining about my right arm hurting, and my wife Gabby looks up from her yogurt and with just the raise of her eyebrows says to me, "Are you freaking kidding me?" So this is from Gabby to all of you. It's very simple, but I need to remember it. She wanted me to tell you, especially you scouts, be bold, be courageous, and be your best. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to do some questions, right? Yeah. Thank you.